Alright, now I'd like to make a series of videos discussing some of the misconceptions about the signs. Because there's a lot of pop astrology out there that's kind of biased against certain signs. I think a lot of it is like, there was a bad ex who happened to have a sun in a certain sign, and then they start attributing everything to this one sign. Actually, on a deeper level, it's more like often there's something lacking within us, within our own chart, that we keep seeking out. And so we keep seeking out a specific sign that we keep going to over and over and over again, and finding it frustrating because we're not understanding. We're supposed to learn a lesson from this energy that we have a difficult time with to incorporate into our own chart. Because every chart has every sign. That's something that gets missed a lot. But even if you don't have a planet there, you've got a house there. You've got something happening. We all have to incorporate the lessons of every sign of the Zodiac. So we're going to start off this series with one of the signs that bizarrely makes the top hit list of most hated signs. Gemini. That's where we're at today. Now, a lot of people hate the sign of Gemini, and I get it. It's the most selfish sign. It's the most yang sign of the Zodiac. It's the sign where the sun is building up to that summer solstice, where there's the absolute most yang and light building up to the epiphany of the summer solstice. So in general, Gemini energy is not that interested in other people. It's not that interested in what you're going to say, what you're going to do. It's certainly not interested in what you need. But selfishness doesn't have to be malicious. Selfishness can be frustrating and a letdown, but it doesn't necessarily mean someone with a strong Gemini accentuation in their chart is going to be a serial killer, despite what some pop astrology would like you to believe. Now, when I'm talking about somebody with their sun or ascendant, maybe their moon, maybe a pileup of other planets in Gemini, this doesn't mean that they don't care about other people. It just means that the momentum towards freedom, towards doing what they want, is going to supersede other people's needs. And sometimes we need someone who has a clear vision of their own freedom in order to clear the path for other people. Now, what really annoys people about Gemini? We'll talk about a few of the symptoms of this sign. Now, Gemini is ruled by Mercury. It's an air sign, and it's what we would call double-bodied because there's two twins, right? All the mutable signs are considered double-bodied signs. And so with this accentuation on air, of communication, of ideas, of relationships, and Mercury, which likes to communicate between two things, it likes to divide things into two, and then find the connections between them and bring them back together. The thing about Gemini is that with that intellectual curiosity, Gemini tends to see multiple points at once. They tend to understand both sides of an argument, and they also tend to enjoy arguing the devil's advocate occasionally, or if the mood strikes them, falling in line with whoever they're talking with. Now this leads us to one of the big stigmas of Gemini, that they're two-faced and that they're liars. No, I'm not saying there aren't Gemini who are liars and two-faced. Of course there are. But there's a larger story here, where Gemini just happens to have this great skill to see where both sides are at and see the benefit of each argument, and in the right mood, agree with both of them. Now that's infuriating and frustrating to most people, especially if you're like a very fixed Mercury. But it's an element of the sign, and it's one of the benefits of the sign. Because a strong Gemini chart with a really keen mind can find ways to meld different ideas together that can actually create harmony. While the trickster element of Gemini trends towards poking people for fun, there is a way to use that humor, to use that cleverness, to use that dichotomy to actually bring people together, and it does happen. So this is one of the things you have to understand. Just because your Gemini friend talked to 2 or 3 different people and had a different opinion with each of them doesn't mean that any of those opinions were fake. It doesn't mean that any of those opinions weren't deeply held and honest truths for that individual. They just happen to be connecting with a specific idea at a specific time. And as you know, if you're a truly evolved being, there's rarely one right side and one wrong side. It's all shades of gray. And Gemini can see that and work through it, fly through it. So that's one of the great misconceptions of Gemini. Consider that maybe it's just that they are seeing more sides of a situation. But mind you, with that maximum yang air Mercury, they are prone to latching on to whatever's happening in the moment, running with it. And Gemini does have an abundance of ideas constantly. There's always a million different ideas. And so when someone comes to them with something solid, even if it seems contrary to something they've been saying previously, there is a tendency to want to just run with that and see where it goes. Let them do it. They might not follow through on much of it, but there's a benefit to them throwing those ideas out into the world and seeing what happens. Now, speaking of the dichotomy of Gemini, let's talk about one of the other major misconceptions of Gemini, which is that often they're seen as like a social butterfly, like flitting about, talking to this person, talking to that person, and living all on a surface level. That they're flaky and airheaded. Now, it's not that I haven't known flaky and airheaded Gemini people. Again, it's a spectrum, and there's tendencies, and you gotta see the whole chart. But often the thing about Gemini is, with that twin nature, there's an exoteric person and an esoteric person. There's the outer and the inner. And Gemini tends to learn how to keep things light when they don't want to share what's inner. So Gemini can be very good at simply being charming and witty and keeping things on this very light surface level. That doesn't mean that there's not a much deeper undercurrent going on. But Gemini never feels the need to share that deep undercurrent. That's for them, unless it's advantageous to share it. And this is where you get into one of the more difficult things for people to understand about Gemini when they get close to someone who's a Gemini, which is they seem like everything's all good and fine and cheery and merry, but then suddenly a switch turns and they disappear. And Gemini, being maximum yang, the most independent individual sign of the Zodiac, when Gemini's hurt and upset, or simply feeling claustrophobic, they want to be alone. And so Gemini needs the space to be alone. Now, obviously with different Geminis, there's a wide variance in that, where, some Geminis really are social butterflies and almost always want to be around other people. And some Geminis are almost entirely introverted, and you'll see that in the full chart, right? Like someone born at night is going to be a little bit more introverted than if they're born during the day, and you can look at the rest of it. But in general, there's both, and they're strong. And so when Gemini disappears, just understand they need that alone time. Don't take it personally. And so that's something that's really misconceived, because a lot of people never see the dark side of Gemini, the dark introverted side. That's kept personal to the Gemini. They don't want others to comfort them. Of course, mitigated by the rest of the chart, especially the moon placement. So this isn't true of all Gemini people. You get this, but I have to keep saying it. So speaking of the social butterfly element of Gemini, we've got one of the other major stigmas that people like to say about Gemini, which is that they're overly flirtatious. and you can't trust them. And they're going to cheat on you. Now, an element of this one really needs to be dissected, which is that being Mercury ruled in an air sign, Gemini likes to be clever. Gemini likes to flit about with the little wings on the feet and make light of everything. If you have to spend 5 minutes at the grocery counter, you might as well make the checkout person laugh. And so often, especially in a relationship with a Gemini, a partner who doesn't understand this thinks they're constantly flirting with everyone else. It can make people really insecure. And of course, again, I'm not saying there aren't Gemini cheaters out there, but just because they're engaged in a witty banter with someone doesn't mean that they're trying to sleep with them. That's an element the Gemini simply needs to get through the day, to just deal with other people. Often, that witty banter and that charm, to the Gemini mind, is all about disarming a deeper conversation, something that they don't want to get into. Often they'll spin people around into a completely other conversation because there's something there they don't want to get into. And sometimes it could even be because they sense there's an attraction between them and someone else, and so they bring it up to this light banter layer. Now, to a lot of people, that banter layer is flirting, and it's a pickup tactic. But to a lot of Geminis, it's the exact opposite. It's a diffusing mechanism. And that one you need to sit with, because I think a lot of Geminis see charming, witty banter as just a core of being social in the world and having to deal with people. I mean, it's much better than being stuck on how's the weather, blah, 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 or what's your job, blah, blah, blah. They're just thinking, if I can make this person laugh, I'm going to enjoy my day more. So there's that. And then I think the final misconception about the sign of Gemini that I want to talk about is the idea that if you have Gemini in your chart, you're supposed to be extremely intelligent. Nothing ever plays out that way in astrology. I think a better word to use for Gemini is not intelligence, but cleverness. Even someone who's born with a lower IQ but high Gemini traits is going to be clever to the level that they're experiencing reality on. They're going to find charming, witty ways around things and interesting solutions to problems at their intelligence level. And that's a distinction that's worth thinking about. I mean, Gemini is mutable. And so the ideas come fast and quick. They're relentless. And they're changing. I hope this gives you a wider perspective of the sign of Gemini. And I'd like to do a video for each sign of the Zodiac, because I hear these deeply offensive memes constantly about certain signs. And it's worth fighting back for unity, for freedom, for justice. But I also want to troll every sign too. Oh, the dichotomy of it all. The dichotomy of it all.